All right, hello everyone. Today is Sunday, September the 21st. Today is the day of the solar eclipse in Virgo, and it's basically happening at the time that I'm recording this. However, it's only visible from the southern hemisphere. So if you're in, New Zealand or the south part of Australia, maybe you'd see it, but it's not visible from where I live. Um, I have already made a couple videos sort of referencing the eclipse, this eclipse in Virgo. Um, the other thing that's happening is that Mars is on the anaretic degree of Libra and is about to ingress into Scorpio, and then once it's in Scorpio, it's going to make a square to Pluto, and um, you can almost certainly expect things to happen around this. Um, Based on the how hectic things are politically right now, I can almost certainly expect there is going to be some kind of dramatic occurrence within the next 48 hours to add to the current political shit show. But we'll just see what happens. You can use your imagination about all sorts of things that could continue to transpire with the awful political situation we're in. But regardless of that, I'm not going to be for whatever. I'm not focusing on the politics today. Um, I have to admit that I'm recording this in a kind of an odd state of mind because I had a strange dream last night that I woke from, and then I took my dog for a morning dog walk, and it's like there's this kind of idea that usually it's like you do these certain things to be. I walk my dog every morning to be healthy, to have good habits and stuff like that. But then like in the midst of this like walk, what was about to get home, I started to feel like um, my illness, my inflammation kicking in, and that my habits of self-regulating and keeping healthy were under the dynamic of the solar eclipse were not doing it in terms of helping me to feel help whatever. I'm still having some kind of minor flare up, basically, and complete with strange dreams and stuff. And I will choose, to keep my dreams private rather than going into them in this video. But there was something about the dream that I felt kind of did go with this eclipse, right? The sense that there is, and maybe life provides us with a certain path that we may feel like the choice to affirm or deny these specific paths in life are very like it's a kind of a narrow-minded choice, like a very you're with us or you're against us, a very kind of zero-sum game. You're in or you're out, and this is the only way to do things or whatever. But then in the midst of that kind of dynamic, there's something, first of all, the question of, is the thing that you're conforming to even one coherent thing, or what if it's actually a mixture of things, and that it's like, instead, like you could consider yourself being, to use the Pisces metaphor, being swept up in a current or something like that, being carried away by the school of fish. But then in there's a kind, you're not seeing clearly that there's a multiplicity of fish that you're swept up in, right? And you think, oh, there's only one way to do things, which is with this huge current, the gravitational force of this mass is. But in that, being swept up in that, you're not seeing clearly that it's not just one. It's not, you're not just following one fish, but there could be a whole mixture of forces that are all stirred up together as this cloudy thing that you're just getting sucked into like a vortex, and you can see that only as a zero-sum game of that you either affirm that and agree with it, or you resist it uh, and you deny it, right? And then in the midst of all this, the appearance of a third figure, right? And a reminder that Mercury, was, you know, considered to, was called the thrice grace Hermes Trismegistus, the the principle of three, of there being a kind of a third option, or like not this but not that but something else, right? And that there's some kind of like the the Hermetic path, or the path of Hermes, is a way out of this narrow-minded binary way of approaching life, right? And that there's something about, you know, I mean, for some people literalize this in a very concrete way as like going beyond the gender binary, and you know, you have the whole thing about the Matrix, and how the creators of the Matrix went trans and used the Matrix as a trans allegory. You have like the character of Trinity, that kind of thing, right? But I'm not going to go so far into that right now. But there's also this kind of issue around, you know, I tried to make a video recently where I was talking, I was reading, I read a whole chapter from Byung Chul Han, and then the other day I tried to make a video where I was going over this more closely, and I have to admit that in the process of trying to put this together, I'm realizing it is like, or there's this kind of question of, by trying to veer off the established path of what people do for astrology videos and incorporating other kinds of material, that sometimes I don't know if my audience enjoys this and they support it, or that if I'm challenging my audience too much, if I'm alienating my audience, or there's generally this kind of issue here that I'm facing when it comes to this, like, if you think about this thing, the pressure to conform to what everybody else does without acknowledging that maybe that's actually a multiplicity, a mixture of different things. It's not just one thing that you're conforming to, but like that in if you follow what the conventional rationale that most normal people seem to have, is that you have certain domains of, let's say, philosophy and critical theory that exist in very specific domains of, let's say, you know, you study literature, right? You study writer. If you want to be a philosopher, you have to study other philosophers and specialize in this area. And if you're into German philosophy, you have to learn German language, and you have to read all the original texts, and then you have to like set yourself up as a person who is an expert in this whole tradition, in this whole lineage, and from that position you have a position to say something about philosophy, right? Or else, in idea, it could be applied to something like political theory. You have to become like a poli-sci student or something like that, and then position yourself in there, and then from that position you have the opportunity to say something and have people take you seriously and be a character that exists in a certain area. And there's something about, like, by trying to create an astrology channel, there's something about like that the pathway from doing astrology to philosophy or political science or critical theory, whatever it is, seems to be sort of like not the very obvious connection to make. But the thing is that if you look closer at all this stuff, the separations that we have are actually kind of superficial, because a lot of the whole idea of the critical theory specifically relates to the Frankfurt school. And there's all these characters such as Walter Benjamin, or who else is there? George Bataille, I guess. I don't know if Adorno was one of them. There's a whole bunch of characters. Even Simone Weil is a good example of somebody who is both a philosopher and a mystic, and and even a communist, right? That somebody, for her, there wasn't this idea of a separation between being a mystic and an ascetic spiritualist, or being a philosopher or being a political activist. For her, it was all part of the same game, and it wasn't like you had to like set yourself up in one camp or the other. For her, it was all, you know, it's all fair game, right? And the if you look at if you go back to things like tarot cards, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and such, it all came out of this secret occult society called the Golden Dawn. And apparently, at one point in time, a bunch of philosophers and intellectuals were invited to join the Golden Dawn or somehow participate in some sort of like esoteric studies. And there's this interesting history where what we take to be the modern intellectual movement or philosophical movement actually has direct connections with the esoteric and with the occult, and that even more modern intellectuals and theorists such as Nick Land, I mean, obviously he kind of got in trouble for some of the things he was saying in Twitter, being a little bit of a troll maybe. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying that I support Nick Land's all his sort of leanings or opinions or whatever, but Nick Land is another example of somebody who comes from the more modern area of critical theory and philosophy, who nonetheless he mixes it up with esotericism and the occult and all this kind of stuff. And so there's this kind of thing where it's just like, I think in this, like, there's this thing that's coming up for me around the eclipse relating to my own what I'm drawn to, what I'm attracted to, what I'm interested in, what I feel like spending time on. And there's this sort of like, there's this pressure with the Saturn-Neptune dynamic around conforming to what seems to be like standard for what everyone else does. And it's sort of like, it's not that there isn't a connection between philosophy, critical. There's also, I mean, the other obvious thing is, I have books such as this one, Dane Rudhyar. Dane Rudhyar is a guy, in this book, he directly references Henri Bergson, and this, and so, I mean, there's a long history of astrologers who were up with whatever was happening with philosophy and critical theory and the intellectual scene, and not seeing it as these like two camps of people that we are just like sensitive, intuitive, non-intellectuals, and then these are a bunch of like hyper-rational intellectual people who see all that other stuff as being beneath them. There's actually a long history where these things mix up and interact with each other, and it's sort of like it's a very kind of narrow-minded approach to things, to say that like if you are going to do one thing, you have to do it this one way, or if you're somehow like breaking the rules or doing everything really wrong, if you are somehow drawing on different, you have to your references, if you're an astrologer, it has to be Greek mythology, it has to be just this one really narrow thing of what's accepted, and if you draw from, it's like it's a stupid restriction to put on yourself, right? It's not even, and it's like kind of like you are treating the world as if it's more separate, divided, fractured, fragmented than it really is, right? So, I mean, there's that, first of all. But, with that in mind, I have to admit that there was, in trying to, like, edit whatever, like, I'm doing this continued commentary or analysis on Byung Chul Han, and I have to admit that by trying to like look at what I'd recorded and trying to edit it together into a way that was more coherent, I have to admit that it did seem to be too much, perhaps, or a little bit overwhelming for trying to apply to an astrology channel, right? And then it did leave me feeling fairly drained and mentally exhausted and just kind of depleted and after trying to deal with that. But there is also, there's something about how that book specifically and that topic, the expulsion of the other, there is also something that is there's something relevant to some of the problems that I have with whatever, this whole project of doing astrology, which was that, first of all, when I first started doing astrology, I studied with Adam Ellenboss back in 2018, I guess it was. Yeah, 2018. I was learning in 2017, more self-directed before that. I formally took a year-long course in 2018, and then I have to admit that a lot of the work that I was doing charts for people that I knew through the spiritual emergency community. But even there's something about doing either support groups or doing charts or interacting in online. There's some kind of thing about like the in-group belonging versus the interaction with people who represent a kind of an other. And I was always I thought my experience with trying to deal with the astrology community was always interesting to me, because there was at no point, I don't have any basis for just assuming that astrologers or people that are into astrology are like some kind of like default in-group for me. And so in that sense, they've always been like, it's more interesting the sense that astrology provides a opportunity to deal with people who are like, you wouldn't, I like, as an astrologer, I could do a chart reading for somebody that if I wasn't in that position, maybe I would never have this interaction with them at all, right? Maybe I would never associate with this person. Maybe I'd never talk with them. Maybe I had nothing ever to do with them. But, and then there's like, there's also this sort of like, there's this thing about like the identity that we have, or whether or not, how do you, if you identify with the role of doing something like astrology or tarot or whatever, or divinations for people, if you identify with the role of doing that, there seems to be certain stereotypes around that, which is, I mean, I don't want to play coy, because I think it's kind of, you could compare that to something like what, prior to getting interested in astrology, I might be more likely to identify, have this self-image of myself as being somebody who would, like, I don't know, go to see like indie bands or like punk rock shows, and have, you know, the kinds of friends who you go out to a bunch of rock and roll shows with, and then like those kinds of guys would maybe like not take something like astrology seriously or something. But this is like, again, it's a stereotype or a cliche, because there's no reason why astrologers wouldn't go to the same show, and maybe you don't even, maybe there's, the crowd is full of people that are into astrology, but you wouldn't know, because it's not such a, unless they're wearing a t-shirt that has all the zodiac symbols on them, you wouldn't be able to tell, right? So there's this kind of thing about like this kind of like cliche stereotype about like types of people, right? And that you are like some hipster indie kid or punk rocker or you name it, that identifies with a certain, like, almost like the Breakfast Club social in-group, and then from that, you'd be, that identity kind of system, you consider people that like astrology, usually like a bunch of middle-aged old women with like blonde, like from like New Jersey with blonde hair, that are like the, you know, like the Long Island medium or whatever her name is, right? Like, and then so there's this kind of like joke about being like, you know, like that whole thing about being like the dodo bird. Like the dodo bird was a bird that would, like, a bird would lay its, like, get its egg mixed up in another bird's nest, and then instead of being like being raised by its own parents, the bird would be like dropped off in another nest. And it's the same thing as like the ugly duckling or whatever, or you have all these animal stories about like a certain animal that had been separate, like a goose gets separated from its gander, and instead finds a bunch of swans, and you've got this one odd goose that thinks it's a swan hanging out with a bunch of swans or whatever, right? Like there's all these sorts of situations where it's being seen as a kind of comedy of errors. Like, what has this young man who was supposed to have this identity doesn't have it anymore. Now he's all mixed up with a bunch of funny astrology ladies or something like that, and it's all just a big farce or something. But it's like the thing about this is that it's actually I don't know. I mean, I think I had a certain I'm trying to I have a certain crisis of identity around all this, but that what I'm trying to say in here, if you contribute, if you figure in all the planetary dynamics, is that with Saturn in Pisces, there's this kind of thing about your options. You can't see the options available in life because it's this cloudy. You're blind to the reality. You think that there's just this one thing that you have to do, and it's like a zero-sum game that I'm either doing the right thing or I'm doing the wrong thing. And if I do the right thing, people basically surround me and give me compliments and support me and validate my ego. And if I do the wrong thing, people laugh at me, they make fun at me, and they say, what a loser, why is he doing that, right? And then you're so afraid of what would happen if the people saw me doing the wrong thing and criticized me that I don't have any option in life, I just have to do this one thing. And that it's and there's the other way of dealing with it is to rather than being split in this hard binary of you're either doing the right thing or you're doing the wrong thing, you're doing the good thing or you're doing the bad thing, that you can say that there's more fluidity to it, right? Or there's more, if you instead of being swept up, it's this. There's also this kind of thing about emotion, that if you're too overwhelmed with anger or negative emotion, that it's being in a river that's the white water rapids, and it's you can't see anything. But that if you are able to find sort of peace and stillness within those emotions, there's a certain kind of clarity there, and that in that clarity you can see that hold on, the thing that I am supposedly conforming to is not this one simple stereotype. It's actually a mixture of different things. And this thing that they say I'm not supposed to, that I'm doing something wrong, is actually also not just a little stereotype. It's actually also a mixture of different things going on, right? And that there's the idea of, if you're able to find a more eloquent, there's a more eloquent way of dealing with this by embracing the mercurial side of it, that says, hey, you think that there's one camp of people over here and one camp and people over there here, and they don't talk to each other and they're fragmented and they hate each other, and that you're either doing this, either you appeal to these people, or it's there's also some other, you can also say no to both of them and do and expose the secret under these people are actually in cahoots. They're in on it together the time. Another way, I think there's a certain kind of dynamic where it there's certain stereotypes around this, where one may be the dual. It plays into the dualism between the head and the heart, basically, right? That the intellectuals are so in their heads that they're just cut off from their felt, embodied human experience. They're in this abstract world of complicated equations and theories, but they've lost connection to their felt, their heart connection with the world, right? There are a couple of I'm not going to read out of them right now, but Byung-Chul, The Spirit of Hope, he talks about how the emotional self, the heart, the moods are actually primary, that any thinking has to happen after the more direct experience of the emotional or the mood, right? And that the idea is, the point is not to generate thoughts or philosophies or concepts as something that's like in a sterile, perfect, it's you're in this vacuum sealed airtight container that's separated from all the pollution of emotions and feelings, and you're in this sort of hyper rational impossible space that doesn't exist, that is only abstract concepts. No, he says that any conceptualization has to emerge from our emotion, like our emotional self, and be in harmony or be in communication with our emotional lives. And in order for thought to be really actually rational or coherent, it has to cohere with our moods and our emotions. It's not that our mind and our emotions are two entirely separate things. Another great, I always think about this one, James Hilllman, the thought of the world and the soul, the thought of the heart and the soul of the world. James Hilllman also uses the idea of like the concept of the multi-chambered heart, right? That the heart has room for like in the most raw material sense, the heart has it has two motions, right? It has the blood, which is used up, it's all of its oxygen, and then the blood that's getting reoxygenated by the lungs, right? And so that the heart isn't just one thing, it's actually two motions, right? And in this, James Hilllman talks about how to be heart-centered doesn't necessarily mean to be negate your rational mind, or that the heart is something that is immune to ideas and concepts. That there's something about how the idea could be like an image, right? Like there's how I was having a dream, and that you could say that dream images are more at this emotional heart level, but then the dream image, if you think about things, if you analyze it, if you have an idea that comes out of that, it's not something it's maybe something that comes out of the thought, is in a dialogue with the image, but it's not completely separate from the emotional reality of the images, the psyche, or whatever, right? If you see what I'm saying. This is all in mind, because this is a solar eclipse in Virgo, which is ruled by Mercury, and Mercury is doing this opposition to Neptune from Libra, and there's something about the there's something about there's something about this Mercury and Libra which very much to me has to do with fairness, ethics, but in the opposition to Neptune, there's this issue of what is fair in terms of how it harmonizes with the masses, right? And it could feel like with the Saturn and Neptune, like this vortex where we're getting sucked under like the riptide, it's like when people like go swimming and all of a sudden they get sucked into the ocean current or something like that. There's this kind of thing about like the pressure to do what's right, what's fair, what's the standards of the society that we're part of, and that it can feel like in order to conform, it's like we have to just blindly let ourselves get sucked into this like ocean current where we don't even see what's going on. We're just sucked into this thing that we have to conform to, or else, right? And then or else there's, in the midst of this, like I said, Mars is about to ingress into Scorpio, and we're going to have this grand water trine, which is going to be obviously a lot of stuff happening at this emotional level. And there's, Neptune and Saturn, even Neptune's going to retrograde back into Pisces too, or whatever. There's something about this huge grand water trine, a lot of, it's like we don't have to treat our emotions and our thoughts or our concepts as if they are completely existing on two different orders, right? There's this tendency to make of dualism, right? To be like, oh, are you approaching it from the mind or the body? And that this is one thing that I have to admit that I did work with meditation teachers for a long time who did take, I mean, the whole point isn't to say like anti-mind or anti-thought, but a lot of the practice of meditating is trying to not think, to just follow your breath, to just be with your body, to get more at this body level than the mind level. But there's something about the, you can't, like, trying to stop yourself from thinking is also kind of like trying to stop yourself from breathing, right? Like, you can't just be like, oh, I don't, or like trying to stop yourself from feeling, right? Like, you have to allow yourself to have emotions the same way that you allow yourself to have thoughts, the same way you allow yourself to breathe, the same way you allow yourself to eat and drink and expel your waste, or your excrement. It's like you have to allow all these processes of reciprocation, of like in and out, and yes and no, and all this kind of stuff. And that it's like you can't pretend like to conceptualize or to approach anything from the level of ideas is somehow completely divorced from the emotional reality, right? I mean, and there is some kind of like, I have seen some creators talk about how there's a problem with the politics right now, which I'm not talking about directly in this video, that there's a lot of stuff going on where it's obvious that people are doing things to trigger the libs, right? Like that whole thing, like we're going to do something to trigger you into an emotional reaction, and as a kind of psychological violence upon you, right? And that there's a lot of stuff where people are, it's kind of odd because I think people with good intentions are trying to say, don't give in to being triggered into negative emotional reactions. Instead, stay in your clear, rational mind, where you can be above, that being in your rational mind gives you this ability to transcend the stormy waters of the emotion, and you can be floating above it in this sort of like air of cool rationality, being like, we know better than but there's something about the if you do that too, like, I don't know, trying to deal with this whole this dynamic going on, there's like my own intuitive process basically warns me against this, that if you are, like, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, if our politics has been taken over by characters who are essentially bullies, who instead of playing fairly, basically have turned the whole game into emotional abuse, right? I'm kind of beating around the bush here, but I'm just saying, like, as a Canadian, I will make it explicit from the perspective of a Canadian, in that it's obvious, it should be obvious at this point in time, that as Canadians, we're not really that concerned about being annexed by America, right? And that there's all these concerns going on about the politics of America, and all the concerns around free speech or whatever it is. Like, I basically have to look at this whole dynamic as a Canadian citizen from the point of view of, like, regardless of what happens in America, as long as Canada retains our sovereignty and we don't get annexed, and we have our free, liberal, social democracy, then in that context, the threat of annexation is explicitly just a kind of political bullying, or a kind of, like, the idea that we used to live in a world where it would be unthinkable to imagine such a thing, or that there's a certain standard of what is normal or considered to be, that Canadians don't see Americans as their friendly neighbors, not like you treat the relationship between Canada and America isn't supposed to be equivalent to, let's say, like, Germany and Poland, or like, you know what I'm trying to say, or like it's not we're it's the suggestion that we have to treat our neighbors to the south as if they are Nazi imperialist invaders who are about to roll over our border in fucking blitzkrieg battle tanks is patently absurd, right? But the whole point about this is that the psychological bullying is to undermine the sense of security, emotional security and stability that we can all rational, clear-thinking people can admit that that's not the case, but that in our rational minds, we're all like, of course the Americans aren't going to annex us and invade us, and of course we don't have, but then most of politics isn't being played at that rational level. It's being played at this emotional level where like it creates a cognitive dissonance because in our rational minds we have to be like, okay, everybody, stay calm, stay cool. We know that this is all just a bunch of silly nonsense. But then the more action seems to be happening at this level of silly nonsense than at clear-minded rational. And that's the kind of the game. That's what fascism is basically. That you're not playing the game by a clear-headed, rational way of doing things. The whole point is to try to just inflict emotional, psychological abuse on people, right? And that it's like in that state of having, like you could have, it's like that in that level, it's like having, as if you had a world where you had all sorts of options, right? That you, like in your rational mind, you have all these options available to you, but at the level of the bully, it's like, you do what I want, or I'll fucking punch you. You know what I'm saying? It's like when you put that, like, it's like when you're under threat of violence and hostility, your priority is to neutralize the threat, right? Why do we should not, we do not, it's not normal we have this sort of alarm bells going off saying, as we are not in a normal situation with our neighbors to the south, and we can rationalize our way out of that any way we want, but our emotional selves are reminding us that there's a real fucking problem here, and I think if we cannot even, if we're denied the language to even spell out and name the specifics of what that problem is, I think then our ability to occupy our rational minds and be able to talk about things in a calm, cool-headed, rational, reasonable way is undermined by this constant psychological, emotional abuse, okay? And it's like, it's also fucking gaslighting, like if I'm upset about this, to be like, oh, please, don't raise your voice, don't upset anybody, don't get worked up about this, right? We have to be like cool and calm and normal and like there's nothing wrong. And then the first person who starts acting like there's something emotionally bothering them, oh, we gotta fucking lock them up. They're a fucking criminal. They're a fucking crazy person. We gotta fucking lock them up and put them away, right? Like, and it's like, but oh no, like you don't worry. There's nothing to worry about. We're not gonna get annexed. The Nazis are not coming to get you. You're like, don't worry. Be cool, everybody. And then meanwhile, constant fucking bullshit, right? And it's like, and it's done on purpose. It's done on purpose so that like the first person, that. All you have to do is like the weakest link has to be somebody who just can't take it anymore and like does some extremist violent thing, and then that justifies the authoritarian regime that cracks down and you don't have any fucking rights anymore, right? And it's like, I don't know. Ugh. It's like, and it's just crazy because it's like, it's like, it's just frustrating because it's like, it should be really clear and easy to see that this is how it all works, but it's also, it's like you're expected that you're just supposed to forget about it, and you just got to get the job done. You just got to get fucking make that money, do the hustle, and pretend everything is business as usual, right? And it's like, even what is normalized in the scene of, like, it's also funny because there's this polarity that's happening in the scene around astrology, where it's like a lot of people are just deciding not to do, I mean, I don't know, I guess it's your choice how you want to do your channel, or what you want to incorporate or what you don't want to incorporate, but it's starting to be it feels very odd to me that there is a, it's like, to approach everything from a level that is devoid of any political conversation or any historical conversation. I mean, and like it seems to reinforce this idea that you're like, oh, of course there's all this crazy shit that's stressing us out, but we're in this, like, this dualism that, like, yeah, we might be really stressed out. Like, it seems like that our whole free society is about to collapse, but don't worry about that. We'll just not talk about it at all, guys. We'll be like, what are you manifesting today? Wow. Like, it's like, what the fuck? It's like, it's completely, there's like, this is what feels like crazy about it, is that there's some obvious problem, but everybody is just gonna show up with weird smiley faces and, like, you know, namaste, brother, you know, like, fucking hell. Like, it just feels really off to me. Like, so it's like, I don't know if there's a right, like, I don't know if there's a right answer, right? Like, I don't know if, like, you know, everybody's just doing the best they can. But so it's like, I don't think, like, for me to try to play it, it just seems, it seems as absurd to play it like that than it would be to use my, you know, forget about the astrology and I'll just talk about Byung Han for an hour, right? It's like, I don't know. Okay, well, thanks for watching anyways. I think this is enough for now. Um, Thanks for supporting the channel. Keep on rocking in the free world.